Oh, hi guys. My name is Sam, and I'm 14 years old. I lost both my parents, and I think it was all my fault. From that moment on, I decided that I would never hide anything in my life and not make deals with my conscience. That's why I'm telling you my story. 2 years ago, my life was wonderful. My parents had a great relationship and they loved me very much. It was like a movie about a perfect family with a big house and a dog named Roger. But our perfect life ended all of a sudden. My father came home from work, looking like someone had died. Dad's company, which he worked for, and where he'd built a career for so long, went bankrupt. This meant that my father was now unemployed. We had some savings, but it was clear that he had to find another job. This upset my father very much, and he was depressed because no new position could bring him as much money as he'd made before. My mother and I supported him as best we could. Even Roger tried to cheer my dad up. A couple of months later, we had to sell our house and move to a smaller and cheaper apartment. It was the final blow for my dad, and he completely dropped his hands and started drinking. As time went on, things got worse and worse. My mother worked literally 24/7, and my dad was constantly spending money on alcohol. One day, my mum's patience ran out, and my parents had a big argument. Oh, I remember hearing it all, and how scared I was. Dad was already drunk that night, and my mum's accusations made him very angry. He was furious and started yelling like never before. Then he got up abruptly and walked in the direction of my mother. I thought he was going to do something terrible, and I just closed my eyes in fear. But then I heard a loud bark. Roger barked and growled at my father and defended my mum. I guess that's when my dad realized what he was about to do. He could have hit his own wife. This thought made him cry like a child. It was clear that my father needed help, and thank goodness Dad understood that himself. The next morning, my mother took my dad to the hospital, and the long process for the treatment of addiction began. My father spent several weeks in rehab and was receiving psychological help. Finally, my beloved dad was back. No matter what, my mother and I loved Dad very much, and we were always ready to forgive him and help. After my father returned, our lives began to improve. He finally got a job and we had more money, so overall, we felt happier. Of course, we no longer lived in a big house in a cool neighborhood, but still, Mom and Dad and I were together. And of course, our loyal and beloved friend Roger was still with us. So we lived like this for about 6 months, until one night there was a little incident. I woke up in the middle of the night very thirsty, so I went to the kitchen to get some water, and I was very surprised when I saw that my father was sitting in the kitchen in complete darkness. When he saw me, he motioned me to be quiet, and when I turned on the light, I figured out what was going on. My father was drinking again, and I wanted to tell my mother right away, but my father begged me not to do it. He asked me to understand his feelings. Dad was working a job he hated, and he kept thinking about the time when he could provide for the whole family, and now he thought he was a loser, and it made him sad. My father said that a couple of drinks helped him to numb the heartache and be ready for a new day at work. And that is how he maintained stability at work and in the family. And if I told Mum, that balance would collapse and our family would get bogged down in fights again. These words touched me, and I agreed to keep the secret for the sake of our family. But after a while, I regretted my decision. My mum was on a business trip, and my dad and I were supposed to meet her in the airport. Her flight was delayed because of the weather, and we had to spend several hours in the waiting area. I was playing on my phone, and I suddenly noticed that my dad wasn't around. I got up and looked around for him, and then I saw Dad on the street. He had a flask in his hand, and he was drinking from it constantly. You don't have to be Sherlock to guess what was inside the flask. I ran to my father and started yelling at him. How could he do this at such a crucial moment? He started making excuses and saying that everything was fine. We would have continued to fight, but suddenly there was an announcement that my mother's flight had arrived, and we went to meet her. I have to say, the joy of meeting my mother overcame all the emotions that I felt while arguing with my dad. Plus, she brought me a gift, so when we got in the car, I was busy unwrapping it, and I'd forgotten that my father was drunk, and that he shouldn't be driving. It was the biggest mistake of my life. We were driving down the highway, and I kept asking my mum a bunch of questions. She was glad to see me too, and she chatted with me. I remember her beautiful smile, and then I remember a loud car horn and a metallic clang. Then I remember the top swapped with the bottom, and I fell on the ceiling of the car. It was all like a slideshow, and then I passed out. It was total darkness. I didn't know if it was a dream or reality, but I heard screams and sirens. Then all the sounds faded away, as if someone had just muted the radio. And just a second later, I saw a very bright light that literally blinded me. No, it wasn't that light at the end of the tunnel. It was a hospital lamp. I was lying in the ward, with my arm bandaged. When I looked around, I saw my father. He was sitting in the chair next to my bed crying. I wanted to calm him down and tell him I was okay. But as it turned out, it wasn't about me. Through tears, Dad told me that my mother was gone. At the same moment, I was just washed away by a river of feelings, and I began to scream and cry. My pain was inconsolable, and there was nothing I could do about it. It was the worst day of my life. As I learned later, the accident wasn't my father's fault. Someone fell asleep at the wheel and flew into the oncoming lane. But my father could easily have avoided the accident if he hadn't been under the influence of alcohol and his reaction time wasn't slowed down. But that didn't change anything. Mum died. And that might not have happened if I told her that my father was drinking again. Then we wouldn't have gotten in the damn car and had an accident. So I blamed myself for what had happened. Dad and I then turned into two zombies who just walked around and tried to get over their grief. At this time, my father began to drink even more heavily. Every day, he drank himself to the point where he just cried or screamed into the void. One night, I was in my room, trying to take my mind off everything while watching a movie. Suddenly, I heard a loud bark and a cry from my father. Roger missed his mother too, and he sat at the front door whining all the time. My drunken father was tired of it and wanted to do something about it. Thank God I stepped in and took Roger for a walk before Dad could do something bad. These walks with the dog were my only joy. I had the feeling that only Roger could understand me. I mean, my father was my relative too, and I loved him, but the man who was constantly drunk was not my father. He was out there somewhere, and I couldn't reach him. It's been a long time, but our lives haven't changed. The grief subsided, but it was hard for us to find common language with each other. One day, I caught a moment when my father was sober, and I suggested that we spend the day together as father and son. He agreed, so we took Roger and drove out of town to the lake. We spent a long time there and talked a lot. We both needed it. I even had the hope that my father would give up his bad habit and that we could live normally. On the way home, we decided to stop at the supermarket to go shopping. At one point, my dad said he heard Roger barking, so we left a credit card and went to check on him in the car. I calmly finished shopping and went outside. Roger continued to bark, and in a second, I understood everything. The dog could smell the alcohol. Dad had another drink before I saw him, and he was going to drive drunk again. Roger must have sensed danger and started barking. I started shouting at my father, and it pissed him off. He was yelling and swearing at me. Then he told me to get into the car. Imagine how it looked from the outside. A man is yelling at a child, and a dog is trying to protect him. Unfortunately, some passers-by saw the situation, and one of them called the police, since he thought that something bad could happen. And that's when our troubles just snowballed. When the police arrived, my father changed his behaviour and asked me to play along with him and to not tell the police about his alcoholism. But this time, I wasn't going to make that mistake again. I told the officers everything. After that, they turned to social services and began a very unpleasant investigation. After several inspections, they found that my dad had an alcohol addiction and that he couldn't care for his own child. And now, they're looking for guardians for me. It turns out that I lost my last loved one, and I cried when I realised it was the last time I would ever see Roger. He's so far away from me now. Everything happened because of that night I agreed to keep my dad's secret, and this led to the fact that our family was destroyed irretrievably. I'd like to have a second chance and change everything, but that is impossible. and I have to struggle with new difficulties now.